This study started out because both Kirsten and I were working in child and adolescent mental health services with young people with suicidal and self-injurious behaviour, and it was really clear to us, that both in terms of our personal experience and the literature available, that this remains a significant problem for adolescents in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Despite several trials that have focused on suicidal and on treatment for self-harm, we still really don't know much about what works for young people with respect to this problem.
And so far there's been several randomised controlled trials for adults, particularly with chronic suicidality and emotion dysregulation or affective instability, but no randomised controlled trials of DBT with young people. So there are some trials that have been done overseas which have looked at adaptations for DBT for young people, particularly looking at the inclusion of families and altering the skills groups to fit with that. And they show a lot of promise, so I guess that was partly our motivation, given that we too were working in DBT programs in New Zealand and there wasn't much evidence yet, so we were motivated to do this study.
But before we could do a big study, we really needed to answer several important and significant questions. What we weren't sure about was whether comprehensive DBT was actually acceptable to New Zealand young people and whānau, and also the clinicians involved. This is a treatment that was developed for adults in North America, and we really wanted to critically evaluate, and from an empirical point of view, its acceptability to New Zealanders. It's a high-demand treatment for clinicians to provide, in that it requires individual therapists to provide 24 hours, 7 days a week phone coaching to young people and families, and we weren't too sure whether New Zealand clinicians would be willing and able to do that. We also weren't too sure whether or not, in a publicly funded mental health service, families would be willing to accept a situation where their very vulnerable, suicidal young person was going to get randomly assigned to one treatment or another. And finally, we wanted to our assessments, taking part in a research study, we know from personal experience, because we were researching ourselves as well, is an arduous experience. And the assessments for research were lengthy, and we were asking people to take part over a long time. This is actually the first 3 research assessments of an 18-month research trial. So we've got follow-up data that we'll be collecting later on, and we wanted to suss out, first, were they willing to take part in these assessments, and second, how long were they willing to stick with it?
So participants in the research were young people and families, and particularly parents or caregivers who were willing to take part, and we've seen at 2 sort of government-funded agencies in the Auckland region. The ages were between 13 and 18 years, and one of the main criteria was that they'd self-injured or attempted suicide in the previous 3 months. Due to the criteria, we had some who had only had 1 instance of self-harm or a suicide attempt in those 3 months, and up to 50. So there was a large variation in terms of presentation and when they initially came into the study. Exclusion criteria included meeting a psychotic disorder, anorexia nervosa, having an intellectual disability, and the participants needed to be able to speak and read English. We had a number of measures, as Emily talked about, and one of our purposes of the study was to look at the appropriateness of the assessment measures and whether they were assessing what we were hoping to target in the research. So they were around looking at self-harm frequency and nature, suicidal ideation, reasons for living, substance use, emotion regulation, and therapist burnout. So DBT is a comprehensive treatment, and it involves many different aspects to it. The first is multifamily skills groups. Traditionally in the adult DBT programs, it's just the individuals that attend skills group, and adaptation for adolescents is typically in this group it would be one parent and caregiver or both would be attending the groups. It's a 6-month group which has 5 different modules focusing on skills of mindfulness, emotion regulation, relationship skills, skills for tolerating distress, and particular skills modules being adapted for adolescents, which looks at dealing with dilemmas that arise between adolescents and their parents, looking at normalising adolescent behaviours. Individual therapy for the young people was once a week for the duration of the 6 months. Depending on the family, everyone had access to 24/7 phone consultation for assistance in skills generalisation. And in some families they had their own separate family worker who provided this for them, and others there was the same person who did both the individual and family. So family sessions were generally done often on a fortnightly basis, so some had their own individual family therapist and some had shared a family therapist with the individual, and they were done as needed in consultation with the family, and then in addition to that was a consultation team for therapists. And the treatment as usual condition depended a lot on what the team or the therapist decided was the most effective treatment for that family. The primary mode of therapy was cognitive behavioural, although narrative was quite a common therapy. And they did see both young people and families, although it wasn't standardised across treatments and provided by a range of different clinicians. And all of the participants had access to medical reviews and to respite care and hospital days as needed during the treatment.
So in terms of participant flow-through, 50 young people and families had an orientation meeting, and of those, 30% declined to take part. So they met with either Kirsten or myself to hear about the research, and just under a third said, no. And the main reason that they said no was because they thought the DBT required too much work. I mean, by definition, it requires them to attend twice a week and a 6-month commitment, and they didn't think that their problems were significant enough to warrant involvement in that. The other 35 attended a screening assessment. From that, 2 weren't eligible. This is a lovely occurrence. They hadn't engaged in self-harm for 3 months. 4 discontinued during the assessments, and there are a range of reasons for those. Our particular question with respect to discontinuing during the assessments was whether or not it was because the assessments themselves were really aversive. And for one young person, that looked like it was the case. The others were associated with changes in circumstances for the young people. But one young person told another, a treatment as usual clinician, that he dropped out because Emily asked too many damn questions, which is fair enough. I asked an awful lot of questions. In terms of the ethnicity of the actual participant sample, the vast majority were New Zealand European, 3% were Māori, and the remainder were South African, from the UK, or from another European country. This is an enormous table. It's really just for people to take more care and attention to if you choose to download these slides off the website. We had 2 sites, one in West Auckland and one in North Auckland. The majority of participants came from North Auckland. The majority were female. The mean age was between 15 and 16 years, and the median number of self-harm acts in the previous 3 months at pre-treatment differed quite substantially between conditions, in that young people in the DBT condition had engaged in almost twice as much self-harm as the treatment as usual participants. And that really leads us to a point that we want to highlight here. This study is almost like the architectural mock-up, if you will, the design, in order to look at the extent to which we can actually do a large-scale randomised controlled study of DBT versus treatment as usual in New Zealand with New Zealand adolescents. That study costs an awful lot of money, and we wanted to check out the feasibility questions first. So this study certainly gave us a lot of the answers to a lot of the questions that we had. We can't really draw many conclusions from the actual outcome data that we've collected. And the reason for that is that the sample size was extremely small. There were differences between the DBT and treatment as usual group before they began treatment in terms of the severity of the difficulties that they were presenting with. And there were variations in assessment times which make comparisons difficult. In terms of treatment engagement, DBT appeared to be acceptable to participants in that only 1 out of the 14 DBT participants dropped out. It was difficult to define, we couldn't really define dropout or compare dropout with treatment as usual participants, because in standard practice in child and adolescent mental health services, you might tend to just sort of end treatment by mutual agreement simply because it's not the right time in the person's life to be working on their difficulties. 4 out of the 15 treatment as usual participants using our quite high bar criterion dropped out. The mean percent of sessions missed for DBT was 9% of individual sessions and 12% of group sessions. And the mean percent of individual sessions missed was just under 30% for treatment as usual participants. The main thing to take home from this large table is the fact that treatment as usual participants did not receive any form of group treatment, the ones that were taking part in the study. In general, DBT had a good attendance rate. Around 10% of sessions were not attended. Individual sessions, actually, it was less than 10% not attended. People had family sessions, group sessions, individual sessions, and in a few cases, med-reviews. In terms of the proportion of people attempting suicide in each condition, as you can see, the proportion went down over time, which is fabulous. And the same is true for self-injury. There's an awful lot of variation in these box plots, but you can see that in general the lines are going down. However, there's a lot of variation within people as well as between conditions.
So we had consumer advisors conduct focus groups with the DBT participants. One of the things they found overall is that DBT was a valuable and worthwhile treatment. Particularly families were impressed with the emphasis placed on including them in treatment. They definitely liked being a part of the skills group because one of the things we emphasised that the skills were not actually just for the young person but for the families themselves and for parents themselves. in terms of managing their own distress and figuring out how to manage, self-harm, suicidal behaviour, and themselves assisting with their own kind of process through a really difficult time. Parents, in the beginning of treatment, we started where just one therapist would be the person who would do both the family and individual sessions. We very soon found out, and Emily and I were the initial therapists, that this is actually a really difficult thing to do. And I know in common practice where we work, often we do have two separate therapists anyway, but given funding limitations we didn't have the chance to do that. But as we progressed in the research, there was definitely overwhelming kind of information that both the parents did want their own individual kind of therapists who could be there for them, but also the actual therapists in the study found it much more found they were much more successful in terms of focusing on the individual therapy when they didn't have to kind of deal with that tear between trying to provide support for the family and the young person. And that definitely comes up, when you do provide 24-hour phone coaching, when you're talking to a family at 11:30 at night, you're kind of there mediating between, whose point of view is true, and I guess the goal is to generalise skill use, but it's not always easy to manage that dilemma. The other thing which was quite important that we figured out towards the end was that treatment ending was for many too abrupt. What we did was at the end of the 6 months treatment they had sort of 2 sessions afterwards where they could do the final closing sessions with their individual therapist, and then they would either be discharged back to the community or they would go back to the treatment as usual facility and continue to be supported. I think if we do a larger feasibility trial, a larger randomised controlled trial, we would do a tapering of treatment, tapering of sessions off at the end of treatment, definitely. So that's something that we've learnt. We also did qualitative questionnaires for the therapists as well as looking at burnout. And one of the really important things in the study is that all majority of sessions were videotaped, both the family sessions, the individual sessions and group sessions. We sent these sessions to the States for someone who works for the treatment developer's site, and they adherence coded the sessions. We wanted to make sure that the treatment that we were actually providing was true to the model, and we found that our adherence ratings were comparable to the most recent study that was done by the treatment developer, which was really promising. The therapist burnout scores, we can't draw too much information from this in the sense that we didn't get complete questionnaires, but we did find that they were in the average range before or after, and generally the support that the team provided allowed therapists to kind of hold these really difficult situations and managing suicidal behaviours within a frame that they felt comfortable. So some of the lessons that we learnt so far, particularly we found that for the majority of families, randomisation was acceptable. What we found hard was that we were doing the initial recruitment for families and getting them on board for the study, and obviously you become very attached to them, and so it was very hard. Obviously we were the treatment therapists in the DVT condition. It was hard to then, when you get attached to somebody and they likewise get attached to you because you are there in the very kind of beginnings of them being engaged in a service, and then they find out that they can't kind of continue working with you as a therapist. That was actually really difficult. So I think in future what we would look at doing is having separate people doing the kind of recruitment and not having those kind of roles conflicting.
This is quite an important point for small randomised controlled trials, and it's not one that's written about much in the literature, but I've spoken with several other clinical researchers where when you've got a small trial, you end up having multiple roles, and you'll have multiple roles with families, and it's very, very difficult to sort of be a clinician and conduct research when you've got a computer that's the arbiter of what kind of treatment the people receive. So it's one that I think researchers really need to pay careful attention to in terms of how to manage their trials. Another issue that they need to pay careful attention to, of course, it goes without saying, is how to stratify randomisation. Basically what risk factors you choose to partial out in terms of before you randomise people. We need to perhaps randomise boys separately from girls. So make sure that there are equal representations of each gender within conditions. And the other thing that this study has highlighted is the need to have equal representations of severity and chronicity of self-harm within each condition. The other thing that we discovered is that treatment ending has to be managed extremely carefully. Contagion is of an even higher risk with young people than it is with adults, and that when you're conducting a group treatment, you have to monitor and pay close attention to the interactions between young people within the groups to ensure that they're not adversely influencing each other in terms of and leading each other into temptation, as we put it in the group rules. Thou shalt not lead each other into temptation. And finally, we think that it's important to consider recruiting outside of services. It took us 11 months to recruit 29 kids. We know that there are an awful lot more suicidal kids out there in those regions. My sense is that there are multiple reasons why they don't present to services, and if it's possible to recruit outside child and adolescent mental health services, I think that we would recruit faster and we'd potentially reach out to, our population would be more representative of the young people at risk in New Zealand. Thank you very much.